A routine patrol gone wrong. The summer air was thick with humidity as Officer Mark Evans cruised through the quiet streets of Riverview Park. He had patrolled this area for years and considered himself the unyielding protector of its safety. To Evans, Riverview Park was more than just his beat, it was his territory. Over time, he'd developed a knack for reading people, or so he thought. His judgments were quick, his decisions resolute, and his biases, though subtle to him, were ever present to those who suffered from them. The day had been uneventful, and Evans was growing restless. As he turned a corner near the park's entrance, a sleek black sedan caught his attention. The vehicle was parked beneath an old oak tree at the far end of the lot, its shiny exterior gleaming under the dim glow of the streetlights. Inside sat a well-dressed black man, intently focused on a laptop. Evans frowned. The car seemed out of place, and so did the man. "What's he doing here at this hour?" Evans muttered under his breath. Recent break-ins in the area provided the perfect justification for his growing suspicion. In his mind, the pieces fit together seamlessly: a flashy car, a lone man, and the wrong neighborhood. Pulling his cruiser into the lot, Evans parked a few spaces away and stepped out. Adjusting his belt, he walked toward the sedan, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he approached, he tapped on the window with the knuckle of his flashlight. The man inside glanced up, surprised but composed. Slowly, he rolled down the window. "Good evening, officer," the man greeted, his tone polite and professional. He closed his laptop and placed it on the passenger seat, maintaining eye contact. Evans barely acknowledged the greeting. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. The man complied without hesitation, reaching for his wallet and glove compartment. As he handed over his ID and paperwork, his brow furrowed slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with confusion. "Just a routine check," Evans replied curtly, scrutinizing the ID. The name on the card read Samuel Roberts. Beside it was an official badge that bore the unmistakable letters FBI. Evans's lips pressed into a thin line as a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Special Agent, huh?" he muttered under his breath, dismissing the badge with a scoff. To him, the idea of this man being an FBI agent seemed absurd. He glanced at Roberts, his expression skeptical. "Step out of the vehicle," Evans ordered, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered firearm. Roberts raised an eyebrow, but complied, opening the door and stepping out. He was tall, his presence commanding, and his tailored suit hinted at a man accustomed to respect. Yet his demeanor remained composed, though his gaze carried a quiet intensity. "What brings you out here tonight?" Evans pressed, circling the vehicle as though searching for evidence of wrongdoing. His flashlight's beam swept over the car's exterior, pausing on the trunk and windows. "I'm on a work assignment," Roberts explained, his voice steady. "I stopped here to wrap up some paperwork before heading to my hotel." Evans's jaw tightened. The explanation sounded too polished, too convenient. "Mind if I search your car?" he asked, though it was more of a command than a question. Roberts hesitated for the briefest moment. "Officer, as I mentioned, I'm a federal agent. I have identification to verify that." "Is this search really necessary?" Evans narrowed his eyes. "Necessary for my peace of mind," he retorted, already moving toward the glove compartment. Roberts stepped back, his expression a mix of frustration and restraint. The search was invasive but fruitless. Evans rummaged through work files, a folded map, and a few personal items, finding nothing even remotely suspicious. But instead of conceding, Evans doubled down. His suspicion had morphed into a determination to assert authority. "Turn around," Evans barked, pulling out his handcuffs. "I'm detaining you until I can verify your story." Robert stiffened, his jaw clenching. "Officer, I strongly advise you to contact your station before escalating this further," he said, his tone firm but measured. Evans let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, right," he muttered dismissively. Ignoring Roberts's plea, he snapped the cuffs onto the man's wrists. The sound of the metal locking into place echoed in the still night, a symbol of misplaced power. As Evans led Roberts toward the cruiser, another patrol car pulled into the lot. The officer inside stepped out, his expression puzzled as he took in the scene. "Evans," the man called out. "What's going on here?" "Routine check," Evans replied tersely. "This guy's story doesn't add up." The new officer approached, his eyes flicking between Evans and Roberts. He paused as he caught sight of the FBI badge clipped to Roberts's belt. His brows knitted together in concern. "Evans," he said carefully, "are you sure about this?" "Positive," Evans snapped. "He claims he's FBI. But I'm not buying it." The second officer's face grew serious. "Evans, I think you should call this in. If he's who he says he is." Before he could finish, Roberts spoke up, his voice calm but cutting. "Officer, I suggest you listen to your colleague. Because if you don't, this is going to become a very big problem. For you." Evans glared at Roberts, his pride warring with the faint stirrings of doubt. But instead of heeding the warning, he tightened his grip on Roberts's arm. "We'll see about that," he growled, shoving the man toward the back seat of the cruiser. As the second officer stepped back, unease etched across his face, Evans felt a surge of triumph. In his mind, he had maintained control, proven his authority. But the storm brewing beneath the surface would soon shatter his illusion of power and change his life forever. A crumbling facade of authority. Officer Mark Evans drove his cruiser through the dimly lit streets, with Samuel Roberts seated in the back, his wrists bound by cold steel cuffs. The silence in the car was heavy, save for the faint hum of the engine. Evans occasionally glanced at Roberts in the rearview mirror, looking for a sign of weakness or guilt, but the man remained composed, his gaze steady and piercing. It was unnerving. Roberts finally broke the silence. "Officer Evans, I strongly suggest you reconsider the path you're on. You've made a mistake, and the longer you drag this out, the worse it's going to get for you." Evans clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He despised being challenged, especially by someone who he believed was trying to undermine his authority. "You can save your threats for someone else," Evans retorted, his tone dripping with disdain. "People like you think you're untouchable because you flash a fancy badge. People like me," Roberts repeated, his tone calm but edged with steel. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Evans didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tightening as he navigated toward the station. He had built his career on being decisive, but Roberts's quiet confidence rattled him. It was as though the man was waiting for him to falter, to reveal something deeper than the surface-level bravado he wore like armor. "Look," Evans said finally, his voice harsh, "I don't care who you claim to be. If you got nothing to hide, then you'll answer some questions, and we'll clear this up." Roberts leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "You're not listening, Evans. I've already told you who I am. I've shown you my credentials. You've chosen to ignore them because it doesn't fit your narrative. That's on you." The words stung, but Evans refused to let it show. He parked the cruiser outside the precinct and exited the car, yanking open the back door. "Out," he barked. Roberts stepped out slowly, his height and calm demeanor making the act seem less like compliance and more like a quiet assertion of control. Evans led him into the station, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. The other officers inside glanced up from their desks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion as they saw Roberts in cuffs. "Evans, who's this?" one of the officers asked, setting down his coffee cup. "Just someone who needs questioning," Evans replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. Roberts stood tall, his hands still cuffed behind his back. "Samuel Roberts," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Special agent with the FBI." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached with a frown. "Evans, Are you sure about this? If he's FBI? Evans cut him off. He claims to be FBI, he said, his tone sharp. I haven't verified anything yet. Just because someone says they're a federal agent doesn't mean we take their word for it. Daniels hesitated, then turned to Roberts. Do you have your badge or ID with you? He already saw it, Roberts replied, nodding toward Evans, but he decided it wasn't good enough. Daniels shot Evans a questioning look. You didn't verify it. I don't need to verify anything until I'm satisfied, Evans snapped. And I'm not satisfied. The tension in the room grew palpable. Roberts remained calm, but his gaze didn't waver. Officer Daniels, he said, addressing the man directly, I suggest you run my credentials. Call the bureau. You'll find everything checks out. Daniels glanced between Evans and Roberts, his unease deepening. Evans, maybe we should. We're doing this my way. Evans interrupted, his voice rising. He's not going anywhere until I'm sure. Roberts' expression didn't change, but his voice carried a quiet authority that cut through the chaos. Evans, every decision you're making right now is digging you deeper into a hole. You've already crossed the line by detaining me without cause. The longer you push this, the harder it'll be to climb out. Evans ignored him, grabbing Roberts by the arm and leading him toward an interrogation room. He didn't trust anyone else to handle this. Not Daniels, not the captain, no one. He needed to be in control, to prove that his instincts were right. Inside the room, Evans removed the cuffs and gestured for Roberts to sit. The man complied, his movements measured. Evans stood across the table, his arms crossed. All right, Evans began, his tone cold. Let's start from the top. Who are you really? And what were you doing in that park? Roberts leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. I've already answered those questions, but let me ask you something, Officer Evans. Why are you so determined to ignore the truth? Evans's face darkened. This isn't about me. It's about you and why you were sitting in that car, in that neighborhood. Is it? Roberts asked, his voice calm. Or is it about what you assumed when you saw me? You didn't question me because of what I did. You questioned me because of what I looked like. Evans's jaw tightened. Watch your tone. Why? Does the truth make you uncomfortable? Roberts leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. You saw a black man in a nice car and decided he didn't belong. That's the only reason we're here. The words hit Evans like a slap, but he refused to acknowledge it. I don't have to explain myself to you, he snapped. No, Roberts agreed, his tone sharp, but you will. Because when this is over, you'll have to explain it to your captain, your precinct, and the bureau. And trust me, they won't take kindly to what you've done. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Evans's face. He turned away, pacing the room. We'll see about that, he muttered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Roberts leaned back again, his composure unshaken. You've made a choice, Evans. Now you'll have to live with the consequences. Outside the room, Daniels and a few other officers huddled near the desk, their voices hushed. The precinct's air felt heavier than usual, the weight of Evans's actions pressing down on everyone. It wouldn't be long before the truth unraveled, and the balance of power shifted, the calm before the storm. As the door to the interrogation room shut behind him, Officer Mark Evans stared down at Samuel Roberts, his fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for the first time that evening, a seed of doubt began to sprout in Evans's mind. Could he have been wrong? He quickly shook the thought away, unwilling to let any cracks show. His reputation as a hard-hitting, no-nonsense cop had been earned through years of decisive action. Second-guessing himself wasn't part of his ethos. Samuel Roberts sat calmly, his posture straight, hands resting on the table. His demeanor was unnervingly composed, as though he was the one in control despite being the one detained. His sharp gaze followed Evans as he paced the room, his confidence slicing through the heavy silence like a blade. Are you going to keep pacing, or are you going to ask questions? Roberts finally said, his voice steady but laced with subtle authority. Evans stopped abruptly and turned to face him. I'll ask the questions when I'm ready, he shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. Roberts raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. Take your time, then. I've got nowhere to be. Oh, wait, that's because you're the reason I missed my meeting. Evans's jaw tightened. You don't seem to understand the seriousness of this situation. No, Evans, Roberts replied, leaning forward slightly. You don't understand the seriousness of this situation. You've detained a federal agent without probable cause, ignored my credentials, and violated my civil rights. Do you think that's going to fly under the radar? Evans crossed his arms and scoffed. Credentials can be faked. Badges too. I don't know who you really are. And yet, Roberts countered smoothly, you never even bothered to check. Instead, you chose to escalate, because to you, someone like me doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Evans opened his mouth to retort, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. Officer Daniels stepped in hesitantly, his expression tense. He held a folder in one hand and a phone in the other. Evans, Daniels said, glancing between him and Roberts, I think you need to see this. I'm in the middle of something, Evans snapped. It's important, Daniels insisted, his tone firmer. He handed Evans the folder and set the phone on the table. I called the bureau, like Mr. Roberts suggested. They confirmed his identity. Evans's stomach dropped, but he refused to let his unease show. He opened the folder, scanning its contents. Inside was a copy of Samuel Roberts's badge and credentials, along with a letter from the FBI confirming his active status as a special agent. The words seemed to blur as Evans's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. This doesn't prove anything, Evans said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Anyone could put this together. Daniels frowned. Evans, they verified it over the phone. He's legit. Roberts smirked, the expression subtle but undeniable. Looks like your house of cards is starting to fall, officer. Evans slammed the folder shut, his frustration bubbling over. Fine. So you're an agent. That doesn't explain why you were sitting in that car in a neighborhood that's had a string of break-ins. Roberts's expression hardened. I've already explained why I was there, but you didn't listen. You didn't want to listen. You saw a black man in a nice car, and you decided I was guilty of something. That's not true, Evans shot back, his voice rising defensively. Isn't it? Roberts asked, his tone sharp. Let's be honest, Evans, if I were white, would we even be having this conversation? Would I have been pulled out of my car and cuffed for working on my laptop in a public park? Daniels shifted uncomfortably by the door, his gaze darting between the two men. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy reminder of the unspoken biases that often dictated actions like Evans. Evans turned to Daniels. We're not done here. Leave us. Daniels hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and stepped out, closing the door behind him. Evans turned back to Roberts, his composure cracking further with each passing second. You think you've got this all figured out, Evans said, his voice low and tight. You think you can walk in here, flash a badge, and act like you're untouchable. Roberts met his gaze evenly. It's not about being untouchable. It's about being treated with respect, something you've refused to show from the moment you approached my car. Evans slammed his hands on the table, leaning in close. You don't get to lecture me about respect. You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with criminals every day, trying to keep this city safe. Roberts didn't flinch. You think being a cop gives you the right to treat people however you want, to profile them based on nothing but your own prejudices. I've spent my career fighting against people like you, people who think the badge is a license to discriminate. The words hit Evans harder than he expected. He straightened, his mind racing as he tried to regain control of the situation. You're not the victim here, he said, though the conviction in his voice wavered. Roberts stood, his presence commanding even in the small room. "No, Evans, I'm not the victim. I'm the one holding you accountable. And when this is over, you'll have to answer for everything you've done tonight." Evans opened his mouth to respond, but the door burst open before he could speak. Captain Ramirez strode in, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her sharp gaze locking onto Evans. "Captain, Evans began, but Ramirez held up a hand to silence him. "I just got off the phone with the Bureau," she said, her voice cold. "Special Agent Roberts is who he says he is, and you've not only detained him without cause, but you've also ignored protocol at every turn. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've just brought down on this department?" Evans stammered, his confidence completely shattered. I was just doing my job." "No," Ramirez snapped. "You were abusing your authority. And now you're going to face the consequences." She turned to Roberts, her expression softening. "Agent Roberts, on behalf of this department, I deeply apologize for what's happened tonight." Roberts nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Apologies are a start, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As Ramirez led Roberts out of the room, Evans sank into his chair, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The storm he had unleashed was only beginning, and he knew there would be no escaping the reckoning that awaited him. The reckoning begins. As the fluorescent lights in the precinct hallway buzzed faintly, Officer Evans sat frozen in the interrogation room, his mind racing with the fallout of what had just transpired. Captain Ramirez had walked out moments ago, with Special Agent Roberts, leaving behind a silence that weighed heavily on his chest. The once unshakable confidence that Evans carried as his badge of pride now felt hollow. He had overstepped in a way that could not be undone. Evans's heart pounded as the door opened again, this time with Officer Daniels stepping in. Daniels avoided eye contact as he set a file down on the table. The younger officer cleared his throat awkwardly, speaking with hesitation. "Captain Ramirez wants a full written report on your actions tonight," Daniels said, his tone neutral but his eyes betraying discomfort. She also mentioned Internal Affairs might want a word with you." Evans's jaw tightened. "Internal Affairs? This is being blown out of proportion. I was just doing my job." Daniels looked up, his expression conflicted. "Was it really your job? Mark, you detained a federal agent without cause, ignored his credentials, and treated him like a criminal because, let's face it, you assumed he was one." Evans slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "You don't know what it's like out there, Daniels. We're surrounded by criminals every day. We can't afford to take chances." Daniels stepped back slightly, but his voice grew firmer. "Taking chances doesn't mean profiling, Mark. It doesn't mean ignoring protocol and treating someone as guilty without evidence. That's not policing. That's prejudice." The words stung, but Evans refused to back down. He was sitting in a fancy car in a neighborhood that's had break-ins. What was I supposed to think? "You were supposed to think like a cop, not a vigilant." Daniel shot back, his frustration breaking through. "You could have run his plates, called it in, verified his story. But no. You went straight to cuffs because it fit your narrative." Evans stared at him, the weight of Daniels's words sinking in despite his stubbornness. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the cracks in his justification were becoming impossible to ignore. Daniels sighed and shook his head. "Look, Mark, I've looked up to you for years. You're tough, sure, but you've always seemed fair. Tonight, though, tonight was different. You let your biases dictate your actions, and now this department has to answer for it." Without waiting for a response, Daniels turned and left the room, leaving Evans alone once again. Meanwhile, in Captain Ramirez's office, Samuel Roberts sat across from her, his calm demeanor masking the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Ramirez leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. Agent Roberts, I want to assure you that what happened tonight is not reflective of how we operate as a department, she began, her tone apologetic but firm. Evans's actions were unacceptable, and I'll personally see to it that he's held accountable. Roberts studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes assessing her sincerity. Captain Ramirez, I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about Officer Evans. It's about a culture that allows people like him to feel emboldened to act on their biases without consequence. Ramirez nodded slowly. You're right. This incident has exposed cracks in our system, ones I intend to address, but I need your cooperation to ensure we handle this the right way. Roberts leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. I'll cooperate, Captain. But know this, I'm not just filing a complaint. I'm filing a formal report with the Bureau and a lawsuit. The only way these systems change is by holding people accountable, both legally and institutionally. Ramirez exhaled, her expression a mix of understanding and determination. Fair enough. If there's anything I can do to assist, let me know. As Roberts left her office, he felt a mix of relief and resolve. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but he knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. This wasn't just about him. It was about dismantling a system that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. The next day, news of the incident began to spread. Local reporters caught wind of a federal agent being wrongfully detained by a precinct officer, and the story quickly gained traction. Headlines read, FBI agent detained by local cop in shocking case of profiling. Rogue officer faces backlash for racial bias incident. Accountability demanded after FBI agent's rights violated. The precinct was thrown into chaos. Calls flooded in from community leaders, advocacy groups, and concerned citizens demanding answers. The mayor's office issued a statement condemning the actions of Officer Evans and pledging a full investigation. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered among themselves, exchanging glances as Evans walked through the halls. He could feel their judgment, their silent disapproval. For the first time in his career, he felt like an outsider in the place he had always called home. In the break room, Daniels confronted him again. You see what's happening, Mark. This isn't going away. You need to own up to what you did. Evans glared at him. I'm not some monster, Daniels. I've dedicated my life to this job. One mistake doesn't define me. Daniels shook his head. It's not just one mistake, Mark. It's a pattern, a mindset. And until you face that, nothing will change. By the end of the week, Internal Affairs had launched a formal investigation. Evans was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, his badge and gun taken from him, a humiliating blow to a man who had once prided himself on being untouchable. As he sat in his now empty home, the weight of his actions finally began to sink in. He thought about the countless moments he had brushed off as just doing his job, moments that now seemed stained with prejudice he had refused to acknowledge. Evans reached for his phone, hesitating before dialing. When Daniels answered, Evans's voice was quiet, almost defeated. You were right, Daniels. I let my biases take control. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Daniels's response was simple but firm. It starts with accountability, Mark. The rest comes after. For the first time in years, Evans felt a glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't come easily, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to make things right. The storm breaks. The morning after the news broke, the precinct buzzed with an unusual tension. Every officer, from rookies to seasoned veterans, walked on eggshells, the weight of public scrutiny heavy on their shoulders. The story of Officer Mark Evans detaining an innocent black FBI agent had exploded across social media, triggering widespread outrage. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, chanting slogans and holding signs that demanded justice and systemic reform. Mark Evans, now placed on administrative leave, sat in his apartment, glued to his television as reporters dissected the situation. Clips of Samuel Roberts calmly explaining his ordeal to the press played on repeat. Roberts's measured words carried weight, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos the situation had caused. "This isn't about one officer," Roberts stated in an interview. "It's about a culture of unchecked bias. Officer Evans made a mistake, yes, but the real issue is a system that allows such mistakes to happen again and again." Evans turned off the television, his stomach churning. For the first time, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: shame. He convinced himself for years that his actions were justified, that his instincts were infallible. But now, as his world crumbled around him, he couldn't ignore the voices telling him otherwise. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Captain Ramirez faced a barrage of questions from reporters and community leaders. Sitting across from Samuel Roberts, she worked to navigate the storm with the agent's cooperation. "I'm not here to ruin careers or tear apart this precinct," Roberts said calmly. "But I won't stand by while this kind of behavior continues. My goal is reform, Captain, not revenge." Ramirez nodded. "I understand, Agent Roberts, and I'm committed to making that happen. But this situation has shaken the department. Many of my officers feel attacked, and morale is plummeting." "That's part of the problem," Roberts replied. "Too many officers see accountability as an attack rather than an opportunity to grow. This is about rebuilding trust with the community and within your ranks." Ramirez sighed. "It won't be easy." "It never is," Roberts said, his voice firm. "But it's necessary." By noon, a mandatory meeting had been called for all precinct staff. Officers filed into the room, the usual camaraderie replaced by quiet tension. Captain Ramirez stood at the front, her expression resolute. "We've all seen the headlines," she began, her voice cutting through the silence. "This department is under fire, and frankly, it's deserved. What happened with Officer Evans was unacceptable, but it's not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some officers nodding in agreement, others crossing their arms defensively. "I know many of you feel unfairly targeted right now," Ramirez continued. "But this isn't about attacking our profession. It's about holding ourselves to the standards we swore to uphold. We are here to protect and serve everyone, without bias or prejudice." Officer Daniels, sitting near the front, raised his hand. "Captain, what steps are we taking to address this? Because it's clear that a simple apology won't be enough." Ramirez nodded. "Good question, Daniels. Starting today, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, conducted by external experts. We'll also be reviewing our policies and procedures with input from community leaders. And yes, there will be consequences for those who fail to meet these standards." Another officer, seated in the back, muttered something under his breath, and Ramirez's sharp gaze cut through the room. "If anyone here feels they can't adapt to these changes, you're welcome to turn in your badge. This department has no room for complacency." The room fell silent again, the weight of Ramirez's words settling over the officers. As the day wore on, Evans decided to take a walk through Riverview Park, the very place where he had confronted Samuel Roberts just days before. The once familiar paths now felt foreign, heavy with memories of that night. He stopped under the oak tree where Roberts had parked his car, staring at the spot as if it held answers to his spiraling thoughts. "Funny seeing you here," the voice said behind him. Evans turned to see Roberts standing a few feet away, dressed casually but still carrying the air of authority that had unsettled Evans from the start. "I didn't expect to run into you," Evans said, his voice low. Roberts approached, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you back here either." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Evans spoke. "I made a mistake." Roberts raised an eyebrow. "You did." Evans exhaled sharply. "I'm not here to justify what I did. I want to understand how I let it get this far. I've been a cop for over a decade, and I always thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I'm not so sure." Roberts studied him for a moment before replying. "Admitting you were wrong is a start. But it's not enough. You need to unlearn the biases that led you to that mistake. That takes time, effort, and humility. Evans looked down at the ground, his shoulders sagging. I don't even know where to begin. Start by listening, Roberts said. Listen to the people you've overlooked, the voices you've dismissed. Challenge your assumptions, even when it's uncomfortable. And most importantly, hold yourself accountable. Evans nodded slowly. It's hard to admit, but you're right. I've got a lot to learn. Roberts' expression softened slightly. We all do. That evening, Evans returned to his apartment and opened his laptop. For hours, he researched systemic bias in law enforcement, reading articles, watching videos, and taking notes. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the problem ran, and how much he had contributed to it, knowingly or not. For the first time, Evans allowed himself to confront the uncomfortable truths he had avoided for years. It was painful, but it was also liberating. Change wouldn't come overnight, but he was determined to take the first step. The road to redemption. The precinct was eerily quiet the next morning. Outside, the protesters had thinned, but their chants still echoed faintly through the air. The backlash was far from over. Inside the station, Captain Ramirez was briefing her senior officers on the next steps to restore the community's trust. Meanwhile, Mark Evans sat in the corner of his small, cluttered apartment, staring at his badge on the coffee table. It gleamed under the dim light, a stark reminder of his failures. Evans had spent the night reflecting on his conversation with Samuel Roberts. The words echoed in his mind. Listen to the people you've overlooked. Challenge your assumptions. For the first time in his life, Evans felt vulnerable, stripped of the shield of certainty he had clung to for years. The uniform that once symbolized his authority now felt heavy with the weight of responsibility he had ignored for far too long. Later that day, Evans stepped into the precinct. He was greeted with mixed reactions. Some of his colleagues nodded in acknowledgement, while others avoided his gaze entirely. His reputation, once built on his aggressive policing tactics, had been shattered. But this time, Evans wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to face the consequences. He walked straight to Captain Ramirez's office, knocking on the door before stepping inside. Ramirez looked up from her paperwork, her expression neutral but firm. Evans, she said, leaning back in her chair. I wasn't expecting you today. I know, Evans replied, standing rigidly. But I need to talk to you. Ramirez gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself into the chair across from her desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Evans broke the silence. I've made mistakes, he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. Not just with Agent Roberts, but throughout my career. I see that now, and I want to do something about it. Ramirez raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. I've been doing a lot of reading, reflecting, Evans continued. I realize that I've been part of the problem. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I've hurt people because of it. I don't want to be that officer anymore. Ramirez studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. So what do you want to do about it? I want to start by taking accountability, Evans said. I'm willing to undergo the bias training, but I also want to work with community leaders to understand their concerns. I want to rebuild trust, not just for myself, but for this department. Ramirez nodded slowly, impressed by his resolve. That's a good start, Evans, but it's not going to be easy. People won't forget what happened overnight. I don't expect them to, Evans admitted. I just want to earn their trust back, one step at a time. That evening, the precinct hosted a community forum to address the recent controversy. The station's largest meeting room was packed with local residents, activists, and even a few reporters. Captain Ramirez stood at the front, flanked by several officers, including Evans and Samuel Roberts. Ramirez began the meeting with a brief introduction, acknowledging the department's shortcomings and outlining the steps they planned to take moving forward. When she finished, she opened the floor to questions and comments. The first speaker, an older woman in the front row, rose to her feet. "How do we know this isn't just lip service?" she asked, her voice sharp. "We've heard promises before, but nothing ever changes." Ramirez nodded, her expression serious. "That's a fair question, ma'am. And the truth is, change takes time. But we're committed to making this a turning point. We've brought in external trainers for our bias programs, and we're working with community leaders to develop new policies. This isn't just about words, it's about action." As more residents voiced their concerns, Evans sat quietly, listening intently. For the first time, he truly heard the pain and frustration in their voices. It wasn't just about his actions, it was about years of systemic failures that had eroded trust between the police and the community. Finally, Robert stepped forward, his calm presence commanding the room's attention. "I understand your skepticism," he said, "but I'm here to ensure that this department follows through on its promises. Accountability is not optional, and I'll personally make sure that every step they take is transparent." The room buzzed with murmurs, a mix of hope and doubt. Then, to everyone's surprise, Evans stood up. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at Ramirez, who gave him a subtle nod. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," Evans began, his voice steady but low. "But I need to say this. I made a terrible mistake with Agent Roberts, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I let my biases blind me. And for that, I'm truly sorry." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," Evans continued, "but I can promise to do better. I'm committed to learning, to listening, and to changing. I know it won't be easy, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I'm here to earn back your trust, however long it takes." When he finished, the room remained quiet for a moment. Then, a young man in the back stood up. "It's a start," he said simply. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions cautious but not dismissive. In the weeks that followed, Evans threw himself into the work of reform. He attended every bias training session, even volunteering to speak about his experiences and what he had learned. He met with community leaders, sitting through difficult conversations and taking their feedback to heart. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his reputation, not as a perfect officer, but as one who was willing to change. Samuel Roberts continued to work closely with the department, ensuring that their reforms were more than just surface level. He and Evans developed an unlikely partnership, their shared goal of accountability bridging the gap between them. By the end of the year, the precinct had made significant strides. Trust between the police and the community began to grow, and while there was still much work to be done, the foundation for lasting change had been laid. As for Evans, he no longer saw his badge as a symbol of power. Instead, he saw it as a reminder of his responsibility to protect, to serve, and to never stop learning. And while he knew he couldn't erase the past, he was determined to build a better future, one day at a time.